Section 6 of the American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Mystery of the Scarlet Thread. By Jacques Futrelle, Part 1. 1. The Thinking Machine. Professor Augustus S.F.X. van Dusen, Doctor of Philosophy, Doctor of Law, Fellow of the Royal Society, Doctor of Medicine, etc., scientist and logician, listened intently and without comment to a weird, seemingly inexplicable story. Hutchinson Hedge, reporter, was telling it. The bowed figure of the savant lay at ease in a large chair. The enormous head, with its bushy, yellow hair, was thrown back, the thin, white fingers were pressed tip to tip, and the blue eyes, narrowed to mere slits, squinted aggressively upward. The scientist was in a receptive mood. "From the beginning, every fact you know," he had requested. "It's all out in the Back Bay," the reporter explained. "There is a big apartment house there, a fashionable establishment in a side street just off Commonwealth Avenue. It is 5 stories in all, and is cut up into small suites of 2 and 3 rooms with a bath. These suites are handsomely, even luxuriously furnished, and are occupied by people who can afford to pay big rents. Generally, these are young, unmarried men, although in several cases they are husband and wife. It is a house of every modern improvement: elevator service, hall boys, library doorman, spacious corridors, and all that. It has both the gas and electric systems of lighting. Tenants are at liberty to use either or both. A young broker, Weldon Henley, occupies one of the handsomest of these suites, being on the 2nd floor in front. He has met with considerable success in the street. He is a bachelor and lives there alone. There is no personal servant. He dabbles in photography as a hobby and is said to be remarkably expert. Recently there was a report that he was to be married this winter to a beautiful Virginia girl who has been visiting Boston from time to time, a Miss Lipscomb, Charlotte Lipscomb, of Richmond. Henley has never denied or affirmed this rumor, although he has been asked about it often. Miss Lipscomb is impossible of access even when she visits Boston. Now she is in Virginia, I understand, but will return to Boston later in the season." The reporter paused, lighted a cigarette, and leaned forward in his chair, gazing steadily into the inscrutable eyes of the scientist. When Henley took the suite, he requested that all the electric lighting apparatus be removed from his apartments, he went on. He had taken a long lease of the place, and this was done. Therefore, he uses only gas for lighting purposes, and he usually keeps one of his gas jets burning low all night. "Bad for his health," commented the scientist. "Now comes the mystery of the affair," the reporter went on. "It was 5 weeks or so ago. Henley retired as usual about midnight. He locked his door on the inside, he is positive of that, and awoke about 4 o'clock in the morning, nearly asphyxiated by gas. He was barely able to get up and open the window to let in the fresh air. The gas jet he had left burning was out, and the suite was full of gas." "Accident, possibly," said the thinking machine. "A draught through the apartments, a slight diminution of gas pressure." "100 possibilities." "So it was presumed," said the reporter. "Of course it would have been impossible for—" "Nothing is impossible," said the other, tartly. "Don't say that. It annoys me exceedingly." "Well, then, it seems highly improbable that the door had been opened or that anyone came into the room and did this deliberately," the newspaper man went on with a slight smile. "So Henley said nothing about this, attributed it to accident. The next night he lighted his gas as usual, but he left it burning a little brighter. The same thing happened again." "Ah!" and the thinking machine changed his position a little. "The second time?" "And again he awoke just in time to save himself," said Hedge. "Still he attributed the affair to accident, and determined to avoid a recurrence of the affair by doing away with the gas at night. Then he got a small night lamp and used this for a week or more." "Why does he have a light at all?" asked the scientist, testily. "I can hardly answer that," replied Hedge. "I may say, however, that he is of a very nervous temperament, and gets up frequently during the night. He reads occasionally when he can't sleep. In addition to that, he has slept with light going all his life. It's a habit." "Go on." "One night he looked for the night lamp, but it had disappeared. At least he couldn't find it, so he lighted the gas again. The fact of the gas having twice before gone out had been dismissed as a serious possibility. Next morning at 5 o'clock a bellboy, passing through the hall, smelled gas and made a quick investigation. He decided it came from Henley's place and rapped on the door. There was no answer. It ultimately developed that it was necessary to smash in the door. There, on the bed, they found Henley unconscious, with the gas pouring into the room from the jet which he had left lighted. He was revived in the air but for several hours was deathly sick. Why was the door smashed in? Asked the thinking machine. Why not unlocked? It was done because Henley had firmly barred it, Hedge explained. He had become suspicious, I suppose, and after the second time he always barred his door and fastened every window before he went to sleep. There may have been a fear that someone used the key to enter. Well, asked the scientist, after that? 3 weeks or so elapsed, bringing the affair down to this morning, Hedge went on. Then the same thing happened a little differently. For instance, after the third time the gas went out, Henley decided to find out for himself what caused it, and so expressed himself to a few friends who knew of the mystery. Then, night after night, he lighted the gas as usual and kept watch. It was never disturbed during all that time, burning steadily all night. What sleep he got was in daytime. Last night, Henley lay awake for a time, then, exhausted and tired, fell asleep. This morning early he woke. The room was filled with gas again. In some way my city editor heard of it and asked me to look into the mystery. That was all. The two men were silent for a long time, and finally the thinking machine turned to the reporter. Does anyone else in the house keep gas going all night? He asked. I don't know, was the reply. Most of them, I know, use electricity. Nobody else has been overcome as he has been? No. Plumbers have minutely examined the lighting system all over the house and found nothing wrong. Does the gas in the house all come through the same meter? Yes, so the manager told me. I suppose it possible that someone shut it off there on these nights long enough to extinguish the lights all over the house, then turn it on again. That is, presuming that it was done purposely. Do you think it was an attempt to kill Henley? It might be, was the reply. Find out for me just who in the house uses gas. Also, if anyone else leaves the light burning all night. Also, what opportunity anyone would have to get at the meter and then something about Henley's love affair with Miss Lipscomb. Is there anyone else? If so, who? Where does he live? When you find out these things, come back here. That afternoon at 1 o'clock, Hatch returned to the apartments of the thinking machine with excitement plainly apparent on his face. Well? Asked the scientist. A French girl, Louise Renier, employed as a maid by Mrs. Standing in the house, was found dead in her room on the 3rd floor today at noon, Hatch explained quickly. It looks like suicide. How? Asked the thinking machine. The people who employed her, husband and wife, have been away for a couple of days, Hatch rushed on. She was in the suite alone. This noon she had not appeared. There was an odor of gas and the door was broken in. Then she was found dead. With the gas turned on? With the gas turned on. She was asphyxiated. Dear me, exclaimed the scientist. He arose and took up his hat. Let's go and see what this is all about. 2. When Professor Van Dusen and Hatch arrived at the apartment house, they had been preceded by the medical examiner and the police. Detective Mallory, whom both knew, was moving about in the apartment where the girl had been found dead. The body had been removed and a telegram sent to employers in New York. Too late, said Mallory as they entered. What was it, Mr. Mallory? Asked the scientist. Suicide, was the reply. No question of it. It happened in this room. And he led the way into the 3rd room of the suite. The maid, Miss Renier, occupied this and was here alone last night. Mr. and Mrs. Standing, her employers, have gone to New York for a few days. She was left alone and killed herself. Without further questioning, the thinking machine went over to the bed from which the girl's body had been taken, and stooping beside it, picked up a book. It was a novel by the Duchess. He examined this critically, then, standing on the chair, he examined the gas jet. This done, he stepped down and went to the window of the little room. Finally, the thinking machine turned to the detective. Just how much was the gas turned on? He asked. Turned on full, was the reply. Were both the doors of the room locked? Both, yes. Any cotton or cloth or anything of the sort stuffed in the cracks of the window? No, it's a tight-fitting window anyway. Are you trying to make a mystery out of this? Cracks in doors stuffed? The thinking machine went on. No. There was a smile about the detective's lips. The thinking machine, on his knees, examined the bottom of one of the doors, that which led into the hall. The lock of this door had been broken when employees burst into the room. Having satisfied himself, here and at the bottom of the other door, which connected with the bedroom adjoining, the thinking machine again climbed on a chair and examined the doors at the top. Both transoms closed, I suppose? He asked. Yes, was the reply. You can't make anything but suicide out of it, explained the detective. The medical examiner has given that as his opinion, and everything I find indicates it. All right, broke in the thinking machine abruptly. Don't let us keep you. After a while, Detective Mallory went away. Hatch and the scientist went down to the office floor where they saw the manager. He seemed to be greatly distressed, but was willing to do anything he could in the matter. Is your night engineer perfectly trustworthy? Asked the thinking machine. Perfectly, was the reply. One of the best and most reliable men I have ever met. Alert and wide awake. Can I see him a moment? The night man, I mean. "Certainly," was the reply. "He's downstairs. He sleeps there. He's probably up by this time. He sleeps usually till 1 o'clock in the daytime, being up all night." "Do you supply gas for your tenants?" "Both gas and electricity are included in the rent of the suites. Tenants may use one or both." "And the gas all comes through 1 meter?" "Yes, 1 meter. It's just off the engine room." "I suppose there's no way of telling just who in the house uses gas?" "No. Some do and some don't. I don't know." This was what Hatch had told the scientist. Now, together, they went to the basement, and there met the night engineer, Charles Burlingame, a tall, powerful, clean-cut man of alert manner and positive speech. He gazed with a little amusement at the slender, almost childish figure of the thinking machine and the grotesquely large head. "You are in the engine room or near it all night, every night?" began the thinking machine. "I haven't missed a night in 4 years," was the reply. "Anybody ever come here to see you at night?" "Never." "It's against the rules." "The manager or a hall boy?" "Never." "In the last 2 months?" the thinking machine persisted. "Not in the last 2 years," was the positive reply. "I go on duty every night at 7 o'clock, and I'm on duty until 7 in the morning. I don't believe I've seen anybody in the basement here with me between those hours for a year at least." The thinking machine was squinting steadily into the eyes of the engineer, and for a time both were silent. Hatch moved about the scrupulously clean engine room and nodded to the day engineer, who sat leaning back against the wall. Directly in front of him was the steam gauge. "Have you a fireman?" was the thinking machine's next question. "No, I fire myself," said the night man. "Here's the coal," and he indicated a bin within half a dozen feet of the mouth of the boiler. "I don't suppose you ever had occasion to handle the gas meter?" insisted the thinking machine. "Never touched it in my life," said the other. "I don't know anything about meters anyway." "And you never drop off to sleep at night for a few minutes when you get lonely, doze, I mean?" The engineer grinned good-naturedly. "Never had any desire to. And besides, I wouldn't have the chance," he explained. "There's a time check here," and he indicated it. "I have to punch that every half hour all night to prove that I've been awake." Dear me," exclaimed the thinking machine irritably. He went over and examined the time check, a revolving paper disc with hours marked on it, made to move by the action of a clock, the face of which showed in the middle. "Besides, there's the steam gauge to watch," went on the engineer. "No engineer would dare go to sleep. There might be an explosion." "Do you know Mr. Weldon Henley?" suddenly asked the thinking machine. "Who?" asked Burlingame. "Weldon Henley." "No," was the slow response. "Never heard of him. Who is he?" "One of the tenants on the second floor, I think." "Lord, I don't know any of the tenants. What about him?" "When does the inspector come here to read the meter?" "I never saw him. I presume in daytime. Eh, Bill?" And he turned to the day engineer. "Always in the daytime." "Usually about noon," said Bill from his corner. "Any other entrance to the basement except this way? And you could see anyone coming here this way, I suppose?" "Sure I could see him. There is no other entrance to the cellar except the coal hole in the sidewalk in front." "Two big electric lights in front of the building, aren't there?" "Yes, they go all night." A slightly puzzled expression crept into the eyes of the thinking machine. Hatch knew from the persistency of the questions that he was not satisfied, yet he was not able to fathom or to understand all the queries. In some way they had to do with the possibility of someone having access to the meter. "Where do you usually sit at night here?" was the next question. "Over there where Bill's sitting. I always sit there." The thinking machine crossed the room to Bill, a typical grimy-handed man of his class. "May I sit there a moment?" he asked. Bill arose lazily, and the thinking machine sank down into the chair. From this point he could see plainly through the opening into the basement proper. There was no door, the gas meter of enormous proportions through which all the gas in the house passed. An electric light in the door made it bright as daylight. The thinking machine noted these things, arose, nodded his thanks to the two men, and, still with the puzzled expression on his face, led the way upstairs. There the manager was still in his office. "I presume you examine and know that the time check in the engineer's room is properly punched every half hour during the night?" he asked. "Yes, I examine the dial every day. I have them here, in fact, each with a date on it." "May I see them?" Now the manager was puzzled. He produced the cards, one for each day, and for half an hour the thinking machine studied them minutely. At the end of the time, when he arose and Hatch looked at him inquiringly, he saw still the perplexed expression. After urgent solicitation the manager admitted them to the apartments of Weldon Henley. Mr. Henley himself had gone to his office in State Street. Here the thinking machine did several things which aroused the curiosity of the manager, one of which was to minutely study the gas jets. Then the thinking machine opened one of the front windows and glanced out into the street. Below 15 feet was the sidewalk. Above was the solid front of the building, broken only by a flagpole which, properly roped, extended from the hall window of the next floor above out over the sidewalk a distance of 12 feet or so. "Ever used that flagpole?" he asked the manager. "Rarely," said the manager. "On holidays sometimes, 4th of July and such times. We have a big flag for it." From the apartments the thinking machine led the way to the hall, up the stairs and to the flagpole. Leaning out of this window, he looked down toward the window of the apartments he had just left. Then he inspected the rope of the flagpole, drawing it through his slender hands, slowly and carefully. At last he picked up a slender thread of scarlet and examined it. "Ah!" he exclaimed. Then to Hatch, "Let's go, Mr. Hatch." "Thank you." This last to the manager, who had been a puzzled witness. Once on the street, side by side with the thinking machine, Hatch was bursting with questions, but he didn't ask them. He knew it would be useless. At last the thinking machine broke the silence. "That girl, Miss Renee, was murdered," he said suddenly, positively. "There have been 4 attempts to murder Henley." "How?" asked Hatch, startled. "By a scheme so simple that neither you, nor I, nor the police have ever heard of it being employed," was the astonishing reply. "It is perfectly horrible in its simplicity." "What was it?" Hatch insisted, eagerly. "It would be futile to discuss that now," was the rejoinder. "There has been murder. We know how. Now the question is, who? What person would have a motive to kill Henley?" 3. There was a pause as they walked on. "Where are we going?" asked Hatch, finally. "Come up to my place, and let's consider this matter a bit further," replied the thinking machine. Not another word was spoken by either until half an hour later in the small laboratory. For a long time the scientist was thoughtful, deeply thoughtful. Once he took down a volume from a shelf and Hatch glanced at the title. It was "Gases, Their Properties." After a while he returned this to the shelf and took down another, on which the reporter caught the title "Anatomy." "Now, Mr. Hatch," said the thinking machine in his perpetually crabbed voice, "we have a most remarkable riddle. It gains this remarkable aspect from its very simplicity. It is not, however, necessary to go into that now. I will make it clear to you when we know the motives. As a general rule, the greatest crimes never come to light because the greatest criminals, their perpetrators, are too clever to be caught. Here we have what I might call a great crime committed with a subtle simplicity that is wholly disarming, and a greater crime even than this was planned. This was to murder Weldon Henley. The first thing for you to do is to see Mr. Henley and warn him of his danger. Asphyxiation will not be attempted again, but there is the possibility of poison, a pistol shot, a knife, anything almost. As a matter of fact, he is in great peril. Superficially, the death of Miss Renee, the maid, looks to be suicide. Instead, it is the fruition of a plan which has been tried time and again against Henley. There is a possibility that Miss Renee was not an intentional victim of the plot, but the fact remains that she was murdered. Why? Find the motive for the plot to murder Mr. Henley, and you will know why. The thinking machine reached over to the shelf, took a book, looked at it a moment, then went on. The first question to determine positively is, who hated Weldon Henley sufficiently to desire his death? You say he is a successful man in the street. Therefore there is a possibility that some enemy there is at the bottom of the affair, yet it seems hardly probable. If, by his operations, Mr. Henley ever happened to wreck another man's fortune, find this man, and find out all about him. He may be the man. There will be innumerable questions arising from this line of inquiry to a man of your resources. Leave none of them unanswered. On the other hand, there is Henley's love affair. Had he a rival who might desire his death? Had he any rival? If so, find out all about him. He may be the man who planned all this. Here, too, there will be questions arising which demand answers. Answer, then, all of them, fully and clearly, before you see me again. Was Henley ever a party to a liaison of any kind? Find it out, too. A vengeful woman, or a discarded sweetheart of a vengeful woman, you know, will go to any extreme. The rumor of his engagement to Miss Lipscomb, Hatch supplied. The rumor of his engagement to Miss Lipscomb might have caused a woman whom he had once been interested in, or who was once interested in him, to attempt his life. The subtler murders, that is, the ones which are most attractive as problems, are nearly always the work of a cunning woman. I know nothing about women myself, he hastened to explain, but Lombroso has taken that attitude. Therefore, see if there is a woman. Most of these points Hatch had previously seen with the unerring eye of a clever newspaper reporter. Yet there were several which had not occurred to him. He nodded his understanding. "Now, the center of the affair, of course," the thinking machine continued, "is the apartment house where Henley lives. The person who attempted his life either lives there or has ready access to the place, and frequently spends the night there. This is a vital question for you to answer. I am leaving all this to you because you know better how to do these things than I do. That's all, I think. When these things are all learned, come back to me." The thinking machine arose as if the interview were at an end, and Hatch also arose reluctantly. An idea was beginning to dawn in his mind. "Does it occur to you that there is any connection whatever between Henley and Miss Renier?" he asked. "It is possible," was the reply. "I had thought of that. If there is a connection, it is not apparent yet." "Then how was it she was killed, or killed herself, whichever may be true, and—" "The attempt to kill Henley killed her. That's all I can say now." "That all?" asked Hatch, after a pause. "No. Warn Mr. Henley immediately that he is in grave danger. Remember the person who has planned this will probably go to any extreme. I don't know Mr. Henley, of course, but from the fact that he always had a light at night, I gather that he is a timid sort of man. Not necessarily a coward, but a man lacking in stamina. Therefore, one who might better disappear for a week or so until the mystery is cleared up. Above all, impress upon him the importance of the warning." The thinking machine opened his pocket-book and took from it the scarlet thread which he had picked from the rope of the flagpole. "Here, I believe, is the real clue to the problem," he explained to Hatch. "What does it seem to be?" Hatch examined it closely. "I should say a strand from a Turkish bathrobe," was his final judgment. "Possibly. Ask some cloth expert what he makes of it. Then, if it sounds promising, look into it. Find out if by any possibility it can be any part of any garment worn by any person in the apartment house." "But it's so slight," Hatch began. "I know," the other interrupted tartly. "It's slight, but I believe it is a part of the wearing apparel of the person, man or woman, who has 4 times attempted to kill Mr. Henley, and who did kill the girl. Therefore it is important." Hatch looked at him quickly. "Well, how, in what manner did it come where you found it?" "Simple enough," said the scientist. "It is a wonder that there were not more pieces of it, that's all." Perplexed by his instructions, but confident of results, Hatch left the thinking machine. What possible connection could this tiny bit of scarlet thread found on the flagpole have with one shutting off the gas in Henley's rooms? How did anyone go into Henley's rooms to shut off the gas? How was it Miss Renier was dead? What was the manner of her death? A cloth expert in a great department store turned his knowledge on the tiny bit of scarlet for the illumination of Hatch, but he could go no further than to say that it seemed to be part of a Turkish bathrobe. "Man or woman's?" asked Hatch. "The material from which bathrobes are made is the same for both men and women," was the reply. "I can say nothing else. Of course, there's not enough of it to even guess at the pattern of the robe." Then Hatch went to the financial district and was ushered into the office of Weldon Henley, a slender, handsome man of 32 or 3 years, pallid of face and nervous in manner. He still showed the effect of the gas poisoning, and there was even a trace of furtive fear of something, he himself didn't know what, in his actions. Henley talked freely to the newspaper man of certain things, but of other things he was resentfully reticent. He admitted his engagement to Miss Lipscomb, and finally even admitted that Miss Lipscomb's hand had been sought by another man, Regnault Cabell, formerly of Virginia. "Could you give me his address?" asked Hatch. "He lives in the same apartment house with me, 2 floors above," was the reply. Hatch was startled more than he would have cared to admit. "Are you on friendly terms with him?" he asked. "Certainly," said Henley. "I won't say anything further about this matter. It would be unwise for obvious reasons. I suppose you consider that this turning on of the gas was an attempt on your life?" "I can't suppose anything else." Hatch studied the pallid face closely as he asked the next question. "Do you know Miss Renier was found dead today?" "Dead?" exclaimed the other, and he rose. "Who? What? Who is she?" It seemed a distinct effort for him to regain control of himself. The reporter detailed then the circumstances of the finding of the girl's body, and the broker listened without comment. From that time forward all the reporter's questions were either parried, or else met with a flat refusal to answer. Finally Hatch repeated to him the warning which he had from the thinking machine, and feeling that he had accomplished little, went away. At 8 o'clock that night, a night of complete darkness, Henley was found unconscious, lying in a little used walk in the common. There was a bullet hole through his left shoulder, and he was bleeding profusely. He was removed to the hospital, where he regained consciousness for just a moment. "Who shot you?" he was asked. "None of your business," he replied, and lapsed into unconsciousness. 4. Entirely unaware of this latest attempt on the life of the broker, Hutchinson Hatch steadily pursued his investigations. They finally led him to an intimate friend of Regnault Cabell. The young Southerner had apartments on the 4th floor of the big house off Commonwealth Avenue, directly over those Henley occupied, but 2 flights higher up. This friend was a figure in the social set of the Back Bay. He talked to Hatch freely of Cabell. "He's a good fellow," he explained, "one of the best I ever met, and comes of one of the best families Virginia ever had, a true FFV. He's pretty quick-tempered and all that, but an excellent chap, and everywhere he has gone here he has made friends." "He used to be in love with Miss Lipscomb of Virginia, didn't he?" asked Hatch casually. "Used to be?" the other repeated with a laugh. He is in love with her. But recently he understood that she was engaged to Weldon Henley, a broker. You may have heard of him? And that, I suppose, has dampened his ardor considerably. As a matter of fact, Cabell took the thing to heart. He used to know Miss Lipscomb in Virginia. She comes from another famous family there, and he seemed to think he had a prior claim on her. Hatch heard all these things as any man might listen to gossip, but each additional fact was sinking into his mind, and each additional fact led his suspicions on deeper into the channel they had chosen. Cabell is pretty well-to-do, his informant went on. Not rich, as we count riches in the North, but pretty well-to-do, and I believe he came to Boston because Miss Lipscomb spent so much of her time here. She's a beautiful young woman of 22, and extremely popular in the social world everywhere, particularly in Boston. Then there was the additional fact that Henley was here. No chance at all for Cabell? Hatch suggested. Not the slightest, was the reply. Yet despite the heartbreak he had, he was the first to congratulate Henley on winning her love. And he meant it too. What's his attitude toward Henley now? Asked Hatch. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tense note imperceptible to the other. They meet and speak and move in the same set. There is no love lost on either side, I don't suppose. But there is no trace of any ill feeling. Cabell doesn't happen to be a vindictive sort of man. Vindictive? And the other laughed. No, he's like a big boy, forgiving and all that. Hot-tempered, though. I could imagine him, in a fit of anger, making a personal matter of it with Henley, but I don't think he ever did. The mind of the newspaper man was rapidly focusing on one point. The rush of thoughts, questions, and doubts silenced him for a moment. Then, how long has Cabell been in Boston? 7 or 8 months. That is, he has had apartments here for that long, but he has made several visits south. I suppose it's south. He has a tick of dropping out of sight occasionally. I understand that he intends to go south for good very soon. If I am not mistaken, he is trying now to rent a suite. Hatch looked suddenly at his informant. An idea of seeing Cabell and having a legitimate excuse for talking to him had occurred to him. "I'm looking for a suite," he volunteered last. "I wonder if you would give me a card of introduction to him? We might get together on it." Thus it happened that half an hour later, about 10 minutes past 9 o'clock, Hatch was on his way to the big apartment house. In the office he saw the manager. "Heard the news?" asked the manager. "No," Hatch replied. "What is it?" "Somebody shot Mr. Henley as he was passing through the common early tonight." Hatch whistled in amazement. "Is he dead?" "No, but he is unconscious. The hospital doctors say it is a nasty wound, but not necessarily dangerous." "Who shot him? Do they know?" "He knows, but he won't say." Amazed and alarmed by this latest development, an accurate fulfillment of the thinking machine's prophecy, Hatch stood thoughtful for a moment, then, recovering his composure a little, asked for Cabell. "I don't think there's much chance of seeing him," said the manager. "He's going away on the midnight train, going south, to Virginia." "Going away tonight?" Hatch gasped. "Yes. It seems to have been rather a sudden determination. He was talking to me here half an hour or so ago, and said something about going away. While he was here, the telephone boy told me that Henley had been shot. They had phoned from the hospital to inform us. Then Cabell seemed greatly agitated. He said he was going away tonight, if he could catch the midnight train, and now he is packing." "I suppose the shooting of Henley upset him considerably?" the reporter suggested. "Yes, I guess it did," was the reply. "They moved in the same set and belonged to the same clubs." The manager sent Hatch's card of introduction to Cabell's apartments. Hatch went up and was ushered into a suite identical with that of Henley's in every respect save in minor details of furnishings. Cabell stood in the middle of the floor with his personal belongings scattered about the room. His valet, evidently a Frenchman, was busily engaged in packing. Cabell's greeting was perfunctorily cordial. He seemed agitated. His face was flushed, and from time to time he ran his fingers through his long brown hair. He stared at Hatch in a preoccupied fashion. Then they fell into conversation about the rent of the apartments. "I'll take almost anything reasonable," Cabell said hurriedly. "You see, I'm going away tonight, rather more suddenly than I had intended, and I'm anxious to get the lease off my hands. I pay $200 a month for these, just as they are." "May I look them over?" asked Hatch. He passed from the front room into the next. Here, on a bed, was piled a huge lot of clothing, and the valet, with deft fingers, was brushing and folding, preparatory to packing. Cabell was directly behind him. "Quite comfortable, you see," he explained. "There's room enough if you are alone. Are you?" "Oh, yes," Hatch replied. "This other room here," Cabell explained, "is not in very tidy shape now. I've been out of the city for several weeks, and—" "What's the matter?" he demanded suddenly. Hatch had turned quickly at the words and stared at him, then recovered himself with a start. "I beg your pardon," he stammered. "I rather thought I saw you in town here a week or so ago. Of course I didn't know you, and I was wondering if I could have been mistaken." "Must have been," said the other easily. "During the time I was away, a friend of my sister's, occupied the suite. I am afraid some of her things are here. She hasn't sent for them as yet. She occupied this room, I think. When I came back a few days ago, she took another place, and all her things haven't been removed." "I see," remarked Hedge casually. "I don't suppose there's any chance of her returning here unexpectedly if I should happen to take her apartments?" "Not the slightest. She knows I'm back, and thinks I'm to remain. She was to send for these things." Hedge gazed about the room ostentatiously. Across a trunk lay a Turkish bathrobe with a scarlet stripe in it. He was anxious to get hold of it, to examine it closely, but he didn't dare to then. Together they returned to the front room. "I rather like the place," he said, after a pause. "But the price is—" "Just a moment," Cabell interrupted. "Jean, before you've finished packing that suitcase, be sure to put my bathrobe in it. It's in the far room." Then one question was settled for Hedge. After a moment the valet returned with the bathrobe, which had been in the far room. It was Cabell's bathrobe. As Jean passed the reporter, an end of the rope caught on a corner of the trunk and, stopping, the reporter unfastened it. A tiny strand of thread clung to the metal. Hedge detached it and stood idly twirling it in his fingers. "As I was saying," he resumed, "I rather like the place, but the price is too much. Suppose you leave it in the hands of the manager of the house." "I had intended doing that," the Southerner interrupted. "Well, I'll see him about it later," Hedge added. With a cordial, albeit preoccupied handshake, Cabell ushered him out. Hedge went down the elevator with a feeling of elation, a feeling that he had accomplished something. The manager was waiting to get into the lift. "Do you happen to remember the name of the young lady who occupied Mr. Cabell's suite while he was away?" he asked. "Miss Austen," said the manager. "But she's not young. She was about 45 years old, I should judge." "Did Mr. Cabell have his servant Jean with him?" "Oh, no," said the manager. The valet gave up the suite to Miss Austen entirely, and until Mr. Cabell returned occupied a room in the quarters we have for our own employees. "Was Miss Austen ailing in any way?" asked Hedge. "I saw a large number of medicine bottles upstairs." "I don't know what was the matter with her," replied the manager with a little puzzled frown. "She certainly was not a woman of sound mental balance, that is, she was eccentric, and all that. I think rather it was an act of charity for Mr. Cabell to let her have the suite in his absence. Certainly we didn't want her." Hedge passed out and burst in eagerly upon a thinking machine in his laboratory. "Here," he said, and triumphantly he extended the tiny scarlet strand which he had received from the thinking machine, and the other of the identical color which came from Cabell's bathrobe. "Is that the same?" The thinking machine placed them under the microscope, examined them immediately. Later he submitted them to a chemical test. "It is the same," he said finally. "Then the mystery is solved," said Hedge conclusively. End of Mystery of the Scarlet Thread by Jacques Futrelle, Part 1.